Today on The Nation Speaks, is getting a vaccine your passport to a more normal life? Or would a vaccine passport just create new problems? Medical treatments. Most of us have no idea what they'll cost before we get them. Hospitals were supposed to change that starting January 1st. Did they? And 40 years ago, President Ronald Reagan was shot and nearly died. We go back to that fateful day with President Reagan's faithful biographer. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. Vaccine passports. They're already the new normal in some countries, most notably Israel, and they're being seriously considered in others like the UK and the European Union. In the United States, President Biden has directed his cabinet to assess their feasibility. The idea of the passport is that you'd need to show proof of COVID-19 immunization to do things like go to a sporting event, go to a bar, go to a gym, or fly. May sound simple enough, but implementing them raises a whole host of thorny medical, ethical, and practical issues. We have three guests with us today to help us sort through it all. Here to talk to us more about the medical side of the equation is Gerald Commissiong. He's the CEO of Todos Medical, that's selling COVID testing and developing new COVID-related products, including an immune supplement. Gerald, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we could start by you just explaining what's the principle behind having a vaccine passport?
Well, the idea of having a vaccine passport is really to reduce the risk associated with different activities. So, if you think about it from a public health perspective, you're really all these steps, wearing a mask, hand sanitizer 6 feet away, they're all designed to create layers of mitigation to the potential spread. People who are vaccinated, who congregate together, they will represent a much lower risk pool than everybody else because they've had this layer of protection that other people don't have. Now, some people may have it because of a prior COVID infection, and there's been some desire to test people who've been previously infected with COVID to see if they have antibodies that compare with vaccine levels of antibodies.
Let me ask you about that. That doesn't seem to be part of the equation for any of these passports, the ones they're looking at in Europe and Israel's. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think it's just administratively difficult to administer. It's certainly not a scientific question. It's definitely just a public policy perspective. The easiest way to show compliance is for everybody to go through the same process. Whether you've been vaccinated, whether you've had COVID or recovered or not, vaccinated is really the easiest things for people to do, even though it may not necessarily be required. So I think, in general, they're just trying to create a standard, one simple message that everyone follows. That is, vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. And so that's the reason why these passports are being pushed. But over time, like everything else, there's going to have to be some adjustments for the realities of the biology.
Right. I can imagine two different things that makes me think of. So one of them is that we don't even know how long these vaccines last for yet.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a big question. One of the things that's coming up, and we're hearing more and more with the folks that we deal with on the testing side, is people who are, especially in the New York area, people who were infected with COVID a year ago who had been having antibodies are starting to lose those antibodies. And so now they're starting to ask questions like, well, am I still immune? Can I look at a T cell test to see, if I still have adaptive immunity for COVID? Over time, it's going to have to adjust because the reality is we don't know a lot about how long these vaccines are maintained, especially in populations that are immunocompromised and prone to having lower levels of immunity. And that's going to be something that people deal with, as the science becomes clearer.
So would you expect from a medical standpoint that the immunity to last different lengths of time in different people? I mean, there's different vaccines, people who have immunity from having been ill themselves. Is that the scenario?
Yeah, listen, absolutely. The reason why people who are older are more prone to getting sick is because they have a lower immune response. And there's no reason to believe that that's any different here with COVID, especially given the higher mortality rates among the older population and those who are at risk. So, it's very much going to be scenario that we're going to learn a lot about who is getting reinfected, how quickly are we getting reinfected, and whether or not, multiple vaccinations will do anything. As time goes on, we start to learn more about boosters, and obviously as these variants begin to take hold, it's going to change how we look at immunity. There's obviously a lot of concern about some of these variants, especially ones that have been shown to have a greater ability to overcome vaccines, like we saw in the AstraZeneca trial in South Africa, as we're seeing with the P1 variant out of Brazil. So as those, spread, and as other similar variants pop up in New York or in California, we're going to learn a lot. And there are already trials that are beginning to test if, booster shots and other additional vaccines could prime the pump. I think that's obviously a very important effort. But one of the reasons why we chose to get into the space of immunity is because, that can't be the only solution for us on an individual basis to protect ourselves. So, we've all seen that we're trying to build our immunity. We found a dietary supplement that we feel has the really strong potential to further protect people, especially with circulating coronaviruses. And so adding, these immune boosting types of supplements to your regimen is something that you can do for yourself to help protect you to the extent possible.
So how do you think you can kind of market that message if it feels like because of this vaccinate message that most people are like, okay, I'm good, get a vaccine, I'm good, and I'll be protected and I can go places. So how are you going to get a message across that actually you need to take care of your health and generally boost your immune system, all of those kinds of things? Do you think they go counter to each other?
No, I don't think they go counter to each other. I think that, people who know that they have, somewhat of a weaker immune system, they self-select. So, we think that it's very much, in line with the way things had been going before COVID, and it's just an acceleration of trends where people, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, there's been, people looking for alternatives to some of those solutions. Certainly vaccines, it's very difficult to get alternatives, but with regards to pharmaceuticals, different things that can help boost your immune system.
So do you think there's any public policy, health policy room for someone who doesn't have a lot of risk factors? They're young, they're healthy, they're taking care of themselves, taking supplements. They don't want to take a vaccine because there are some risks involved, and they feel like even if they get COVID, it's not going to be so bad. But do you think there's a kind of public policy room, something in conjunction with passports or who knows what, that could address those kinds of people?
I think from a practical standpoint, if the people who are choosing not to get the vaccine, they're already built into the strategy. Herd immunity comes once you hit, 70, 80, 90%, whatever that number is. And, by definition, a certain number of people are going to get vaccinated. And if you don't get vaccinated and you go out, you eventually will get COVID. And therefore, some immunity will build up. If that's going to be, if you're going to be in an at-risk environment. So, whether we like it or not, it's built into the models. I think as more and more people get vaccinated, and hopefully we reach some threshold levels, that other alternatives will be able to be used to kind of mitigate the risk in that unvaccinated population, and therefore still really help to reduce the spread.
And we've got to wrap up, but let me just ask you one more medical question. Is it possible to get the vaccine but also not have the antibodies develop, hence not be protected actually?
Oh, absolutely. That's something that you see in people who are immunocompromised. And certain people have been reinfected. So, if COVID doesn't protect you, then the vaccine is unlikely to protect you. But that's a small number of people. So I think, it's certainly, as you get vaccinated, we believe, and we think it's very prudent to, test yourself. Are you developing antibodies? What threshold do they go to after you've been vaccinated? And then, do they stay there? Or do they start to come down? And, do they start to come down to levels that make you concerned? We think, monitoring, your COVID status is going to be important, in the months ahead, because that will guide probably some decision making with regards to getting vaccinated again, a booster shot. There's a lot of reasons why that makes sense. So we think that, right now the message is vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. But over time, the message is going to shift to vaccinate and monitor yourself. And so we've positioned ourselves there. We have a relationship with a company called Aditex that's developed a very, very precise method to measure antibodies and is adding T cell and B cell immunity to determine whether you've developed longer-term adaptive immunity, which could protect you, for a more extended period of time.
Okay, sorry, I have to ask you one last question before we wrap up here. Are there, to monitor yourselves, are there quick and inexpensive ways to do that?
So right now, there are some rapid tests that are being developed just to see if you have antibodies. The threshold and the types of antibodies on those rapid tests are not really outlined, but some information is better than no information. So yeah, there are some of those tests out there on the market, and then you can do more quantitative tests that give you kind of a better profile of your immune status, and those are the types of things that you would maybe take once a quarter. So it really depends on how worried you are about COVID, and what your risk level is, and really if you've been vaccinated to be able, or previously infected, to be able to want to monitor that type of activity.
All right, got it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Gerald.
Thank you very much.
So thinking simply about immunity, we just heard why public health officials will prefer a policy that sends that one simple message of vaccinate, 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 even if we know that vaccines aren't 100% effective or all that necessary for 100% of the population. So that's one part of the equation, but there are others too, including many ethical and practical considerations. Our next two guests need to do a great deal of thinking about these issues. Joining us now is Dr. Sarah Chan. She's an expert in bioethics at the University of Edinburgh's College of Medicine, and Jeff Price, probably the world's top expert on aviation security and airport management. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Dr. Chan, I'd like to start with you. Since the idea of vaccine passports is a lot more advanced in the UK, it's already been a hot topic for a little while there. What are the top one or two sticking points for people in that debate?
Well, I think first of all, we need to be careful about putting, if you like, too many eggs in the vaccination basket. So checking vaccination status is one tool that could help us to reduce the international spread of COVID that could be caused by travel. But it's not the only tool we have, and it won't necessarily be the most effective. So as you've just heard from Dr. Commissiong, at the moment we have limited data on how effective vaccines are going to be at controlling the spread of COVID. So we know they're individually protective, they probably reduce transmission, but they might not suppress it entirely. And we also don't know if the vaccines we currently have will be effective against all the new variants that could emerge. So I think pinning all our hopes on and putting all our efforts into vaccine passports as the main solution to opening up travel might be the wrong strategy. And if we put too much emphasis on passports as the sole strategy, I think we risk creating a false sense of security that might lead people actually to increase their personal risk behaviours. So they think, well, we're vaccinated, we'll stop wearing masks, we'll stop observing social distancing. And then at a broader policy level, I think that focus on passports might also distract from other measures, including promoting vaccination as a widespread measure itself, structural and social interventions to address the wider effects of the pandemic, such as education, mental health, and so forth. So I think the first concern is just practicality. Is this where we should be focusing our efforts? And I'm not sure it is.
So how about you, Jeff, from the airline industry's perspective? What's their perspective on the prospect of vaccine passports?
Really, the perspective comes down to infrastructure and how much training is going to be required to go into this. There was a time back in the late 80s where airplane Pan Am 103 blew up coming out of Heathrow, and immediately the United States tried to implement the security questions process that were asked by the airline ticket agents, and it was basically, did you pack your bag yourself? Did anyone unknown to you ask you to carry something? Have your bag's been out of your control? And what they really did is they took an Israeli process and they watered it down extensively, and then they tried to implement it and get the same results, and it was just disastrous. It didn't work. And I can very much see the same type of situation forming here. Is there's going to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put into place, and a tremendous amount of training for the ticket agents, for gate agents, for all the people within the airline system as to, okay, how do I vet whatever this new credential is. And I just, in all honesty, got my second COVID vaccine shot yesterday. And I was looking at the card that they gave me for my shot. And frankly, that thing is not really difficult to duplicate. And they said, well, take a picture of it and at least keep that with you in case you're asked. And I'm like, well, I have Photoshop too. So, I mean, there's a lot of technical problems involved in this. And I really wonder, is this so much infrastructure to try and really it's a solution looking for a problem? I think we should be doing other things that aren't so infrastructure heavy and so personnel heavy.
So that's your point of view. Let me just quickly ask Dr. Chen, we'll go back to you, but this is your point of view from security and implementation perspective, but it seems like a lot of airlines want it or getting on board with it because they want people back in the air. Is that true? Jeff?
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'll get back to Dr. Chen in a minute. I know she wanted to jump in on something.
No problem. I think it's true to an extent. The airlines, in fact, actually, Pan Am implemented the Israeli security, let's just call them profiling strategies. That's what they were. And there was a lot of passenger pushback to that. But it got people flying Pan Am again for a period of time. And I think the airlines are saying, yes, we're all for this. But I think what you'll find as we move closer to this, they're going to want somebody else to do this vetting. They're going to want to put this on TSA. They're going to want to put this on the airport operator. And even if they decide, okay, we'll do it ourselves, I suspect that once the costs start rising on this, they're going to water down the procedure to the point where it's ineffective.
Interesting. All right, Dr. Chan, back to you.
So I think Jeff's completely right there. I think vaccine passports are a disproportionately technologically heavy solution, and they're likely to be a waste of resources. But beyond that, I think there are also serious ethical concerns. I think that it's an unnecessarily divisive approach, and I think it's going to create more unfairness and inequality in an already unequal society. So just to expand on that, I think the problem with even talking about vaccine passports in this way is that it puts the focus on the individual. So the very idea of a passport is that it's about my individual rights and entitlements. It's a selfish approach. It promotes an ethos of every person for themselves, me first, me, what am I allowed to do? And what we should actually be focusing on from a public health point of view with vaccination is the collective benefits to the population. So vaccination shouldn't be about, can I go to the pub, can I go on a holiday this year? It should be about fulfilling my duty to protect others and a cooperative effort by global society for the benefit of humanity. And in fact, if we start deciding who's allowed to freely participate in society based on individual vaccination status, we're really trying to put the responsibility onto individuals to be vaccinated. And that in turn assumes that whether or not a person has been vaccinated is wholly a matter of their own completely free choice. And that's just not the case. In fact, vaccination is going to be dependent on a whole load of other factors beyond people's control, such as ability to access the vaccine, pre-existing health conditions, and so forth. So, in fact, it would be extremely unfair to start limiting what people can do and where they can go based on individual vaccination status. Now, I said it would be divisive. We've seen consistently throughout this pandemic, and we know from past experience, that trying to assign blame and responsibility to individuals for protecting or failing to protect their own health is just less effective than strategies that try and address the structural factors that facilitate collective approaches to promoting public health. And that's what we should be looking for in this case.
Right, and those, differences, or even across countries. I mean, Dr. Tedros, head of WHO, said the other day that he doesn't want the vaccine passports because there's some countries, poorer countries, that don't have any vaccines yet or very little, and young, healthy people will want to travel in richer countries, so they'll be running to get their vaccines, and so that'll create distribution issues.
Yeah, absolutely. The effect on worsening inequalities is likely to bite the hardest at the level of global society. So when we take into account, as you said, vast disparities in access to vaccination and the potential issues created by the existence of multiple vaccines is something we need to talk about. People in low and middle income countries are already disadvantaged with respect to healthcare generally. They're further disadvantaged with respect to COVID because they have less access to vaccinations. So are we saying we should compound that and make it worse by imposing even further restrictions on their freedom of movement? And then if we start to have not just one form of vaccine passport, but let's say different passports depending on which vaccine people have had. So we're starting to see, differences in which vaccines are approved in which countries based on who they're made by, where they're made, etc. What if we start to have different passports depending on which vaccine people have had? So we've seen China has suggested that people who've had the Chinese vaccine are going to be given preferential access to being able to enter the country. So really here we're talking about creating new categories of global disadvantage. We're turning people into second and third class biocitizens, and I think that's deeply, deeply concerning.
And Jeff, I know that the flight attendants and airport or airline officials having to enforce mask mandates is already pretty problematic. From that perspective, how do you think they will react to having to enforce? Because I can imagine too, as Dr. Chan was just talking about, different vaccinations, have different effectiveness. Then someone's like, I'm pregnant, I can't take it. I think I'm pregnant, so I didn't take it, et cetera, et cetera. I can just imagine so many different scenarios.
Absolutely. We're talking about putting a lot of responsibility on people that really didn't sign up for this and aren't really necessarily qualified to make a lot of these decisions. I remember early on, TSA did an initiative where they wanted to take everybody's temperature as they were coming into the checkpoint. And if your temperature was too high, well, then you weren't flying that day. So, but there was no back into the infrastructure of that. It was, okay, I'm going to send you back to the ticket counter for a refund. Do you get a note? How does that work? And they didn't have all that back end structure in place. And even if they had had it, all you're doing is backing up lines even more and slowing aviation down even further. And as Dr. Chan pointed out, we're really creating several tiers of individuals out there. One of the benefits of aviation is if you have an airport, you have access to the world's air transportation system in some way, shape, or form. And that is across borders, that's across, to a certain extent, financial lines, because as long as you've got an airport, you at least have access. Now you're putting in an additional barrier to entry into the aviation system, and then you're asking people who are not qualified to make these decisions. It really is it the ticket agent's responsibility, and nothing against a ticket agent or an airport operator or a flight attendant. I mean, I've been in these positions before in these various roles, capacities. Enforcing the mask mandate has been horrendous on the industry, because what do you do when someone doesn't wear a mask? Well, if you're a flight attendant, you're telling the captain's landing the plane prematurely where it's not supposed to be, and now we got to get cops on board involved all because someone doesn't want to wear a mask. How does that play out at the ticket counter when the exact situation is, well, I think I might be pregnant, so I didn't get the vaccine? Well, who gets to make that call at this point? A ticket agent at the airlines? That's what their level of qualification is determine that. So I think you're creating a lot of unnecessary processes. I think the airlines are going down the wrong path on this. This is not the way to go with this. It's not solving the problem.
So we just have about 2 minutes left. Dr. Chan, I want to ask you, what do you think the best policy should be in order to, stop the spread internationally, but do something, reasonable?
The best way to make sure the virus can't spread internationally is to make sure everybody has access to vaccination at a global level, and that's where we should be focusing our efforts.
And what do you think the airline position should be at this point, Jeff?
Well, I think the airline position should be, let's get people back flying, but let's do it in a way that is reasonable and practical. And instead of coming up with a solution to go look for a problem now to solve and not thinking about the back end of this, let's come up with solutions that are actually effective. When TSA tried that pilot program, the CDC came right out and said, that doesn't work. So I think we really need to listen to the experts on this.
Excellent. All right. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, hospitals, they're required to post all of their prices online, but are they? We'll find out. But first, this week, President Joe Biden held his first press conference taking questions from reporters. So for America Q&A, we asked regular Americans what they would ask the president if they had the chance.
Where is the help that supposedly I'm supposed to get? I lost my job a year ago because of the pandemic. I used to work for a theme park.
I'd probably ask him what his future plans are, like where he wants to have the country, like what changes he wants to make over the next 4 years. He says it over the news, but I feel like him saying it directly to you one-on-one would be a different answer, maybe.
President Biden, when are we going to get rid of these masks?
How
is he gonna support a small business because they suffered so much in the pandemic era?
Why did he lift up the mask mandate? I don't feel like it was time.
How soon does he think everything could go back to normal?
I would say, President Biden, are you aware of the situation at our southern border, and what are you going to do to fix it?
He needs to put a lot of energy and a lot of thought to work on peace.
I don't know if I'm the appropriate person to ask that question.
I don't know.
Can you leave office?
Shush. I don't know. I think Joe Biden is doing an awesome job. I love him. I picked him. And I like that he has unity and that he's different.
Are we getting another stimulus check? Because I need some money.
Just keep bringing out those vaccines, and you know, the more that people get vaccinated, the faster we can get rid of these.
I have so many questions for him. Is he going to be better than Trump? That's the total of the questions.
Why he not do as he promised to be? He said, I will be the president on both sides, no Democrat, no Republican.
I guess what his plan is for the economy for the next 4 years.
What does he think about the whole vaccination, if he wants everyone to get it and whatnot?
Just how your body's going to react to it and what's going to happen.
Hospital price transparency is meant to help you shop around for treatments and not be shocked when the bill comes. We don't buy anything else without knowing the price first, so why hasn't it been that way in medicine? So how is this new rule working out? Our next two guests are here to answer that. Joining us now to tell us how it's going is David Balat. He's the Director of Right on Healthcare with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He was also CEO of a hospital and a healthcare executive for nearly 20 years. And Seth Denson, business and market analyst with a focus on healthcare sector as the CEO and founder of DDP Advisors. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be here.
Thank you. So, the Trump administration required hospitals to make their prices transparent to help consumers shop around. That went into practice in January. So it's been a few months now, and I want to get a sense from you how that's going. Seth, why don't you start us out from a consumer point of view? Has it been helpful?
No. No, it really hasn't. I mean, I think what we're seeing by and large nationwide is many of these hospitals are complying with the law. Great. But how you comply, well, that's a different story. I mean, they're putting this information out there, but they're doing it in a way that the average consumer just quite frankly couldn't understand. I mean, most consumers don't know what 20 ICD-10 codes go into a knee replacement. So if I'm going to a hospital system's website to try to determine what the true cost of that which I may be getting, unless I have a quantum physics degree in healthcare numbers, I'm probably not going to be able to figure it out.
So do you think, or maybe David, you can answer this, is this kind of willful noncompliance by the hospitals, or is it just that complicated?
Oh, no, it's absolutely willful noncompliance. They stand to do much better financially by not showing you the price. And they've gone to great lengths to show their cards. They don't want us to know the price. They've sued the Trump administration in court. They took it to the appellate court. Just this week in the Wall Street Journal, we've seen that they're actively using coding specialists to try to prevent you from being able to do a search of those who say they're being compliant from being able to find those prices. So this is absolutely willful noncompliance, even from those that are saying that they're complying.
Yeah, I tried myself to go online. I went to 2 or 3 hospitals and tried to find a knee replacement, the cost, and I was confounded. I mean, I got there at some places, but I still wasn't sure what I was looking at. Seth, have you heard from consumers who have been trying to shop around what their experience is?
Yeah, I mean, the same experience that you're seeing, Cindy, in that you know, they don't really know what to look for. And that's the reality. And it was just mentioned just a moment ago, right, that hospitals are getting tech people, coders to come in and make sure that search engines like Google and Bling and these others can't even search for these prices either. So all of that is part of this this ambiguity that the hospital systems for years have been able to profit off of. And for the average consumer, again, they don't know exactly what they're looking for. You look for a knee price. Well, okay, well, what's bundled, what's unbundled? Is the anesthesiologist involved in that? Is the surgical assistant? Is this a facility charge? There's a lot of moving parts in this, and then you got to add in, okay, what's my network insurance contract say to this? And I mean, there's just so many moving parts, and right now the hospital systems don't want to comply. And I think if there's one other thing I would say to this, is that unfortunately, and while I love that the Trump administration took this step, I'm not demeaning this step, I think it's a great step, but the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. The fine for noncompliance was $300 a day. That's a rounding error for a lot of these hospitals. So I think this was a good step, but so much more needs to be done.
So if hospitals are putting something online that's not searchable and not that helpful, I guess they're getting around that $300 fine. Is that right?
Well, they are, and they're getting around the optics of saying that they're non-complying. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's the compliance. Just because they're putting out average prices or they're putting out something that they say that they're meeting compliance with, it doesn't mean that they're complying with the letter of the law. And frankly, just like Seth was saying, they're willing to pay the penalty. So they want to look good and be able to protect themselves at the same time, and they're happy to pay the penalty. It's less than $110,000 a year. As Seth said, that's a rounding error for many of the hospitals, and they're happy to pay the fine. The good thing is that many states now are taking this on and codifying it at the state level and making those penalties much more punitive.
So actually, David, let me ask you from a public policy standpoint, would there have been a better way to write that law initially, knowing some of these outcomes would be likely?
Well, it's important for the audience to understand it's not a law. It's a condition of the ACA. But when we're looking at what the President Trump did is he put in an executive order what those prices are. The ACA says that the prices must be listed. Initially, the hospitals were putting out their big charge master prices, those big hyperinflated charges that people just they scare and frighten us when we see these $100,000 and $200,000 charges. But that's not what President Trump and the administration really set out to do. They're looking at the real prices, the negotiated rates between insurers and hospitals, and so that's what we're looking at now.
And Seth, you were mentioning earlier that there are a lot of moving parts in this. So is it even possible for the hospitals to list something meaningful?
Well, it certainly is, but we have to go back to the basics, because what we're going to need to go back to is a recognition of how our insurance contracts work. Listen, I call for and advocated for in my book, The Cure, the elimination of insurance contract networks. They don't provide any value. Originally, when they came into play, they were to try to steer people to hospitals with a discount off of the charge master, which originally was supposed to be accurate. It's not now because it's overly inflated. But so you really got to go back to the fundamentals. Listen, an MRI is an MRI is an MRI, regardless of whether or not I've got Blue Cross, United Healthcare, Cigna, or Aetna. So until we have real insurance reform where insurance starts to work like what we call an indemnity program, where it's reimbursing the charge, unfortunately, I don't know that we'll get to a place unless there is a very searchable database, almost like an Amazon, for a knee replacement under United Healthcare that I can go search and I can get the average prices. There are some in the private sector that do this. They'll take network data and start to break it down and analyze it, but those systems cost money. Many employers buy them for their employees, but at the end of the day, the American consumer still has to use them.
So Seth, what do the insurance companies think of all of this? Do they want or not want price transparency?
No, no. Listen. If you look at the average stock price of a health insurance company since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, massive triple digits. Some of them over 1,000%. United Health Group posted just last year an over 1,000% stock price increase since the passage. This is working well. What happened as a result of the Affordable Care Act was it took the health insurance industry and the health care systems, which had historically been in conflict with one another, and it aligned them. The health insurer is now the finance company of the healthcare system. For them to continue to generate more profits, they actually want claims to go up. And they hide behind the veil of confidentiality in these contracts to make sure the consumer doesn't know what's going on. And everyone in the system except for the consumer is rewarded for it.
So, David, as a former CEO of a hospital, is there any incentive for a hospital to put them out there to get, more business competition? Would you have not complied had you still been CEO of a hospital?
Well, when I was there, I actually looked for opportunities to provide discounted rates for cash patients. Unfortunately, that's the only way that you can do it because there are so many laws that make it more difficult under the insurance auspices. So what I did do, and what many organizations are doing now, actually more and more are, let's talk about MRIs and CAT scans, the way Seth just brought up. Honestly, they could be so affordable that you wouldn't even need the insurance. Insurance has driven up the cost of MRIs and CAT scans. In the state of Texas, I could get a $250 CAT scan. I could get a $400 MRI. Those are things that you wouldn't normally even need insurance for because you would have to pay those dollar amounts out of your deductible. And in fact, the negotiated rate for a CAT scan or MRI is thousands of dollars, not hundreds. So it's not only insurance reform that we need to look at. We need to look at making healthcare more affordable again. And in order to do that, price transparency is the first step needed to make people consumers of the healthcare sector. But absolutely, we would certainly have done that in my facilities. But it's difficult nowadays because they stand to lose a lot of money, especially on bigger surgeries. Okay, so just to ask each of you before we wrap up, how would you recommend going about this to get the intended outcomes of, price transparency that's going to be helpful to consumers? Seth?
Yeah, again, I think you've got to start legislatively at insurance reform. It's not likely that's going to happen just because, you've got the healthcare lobby by and large when you add in pharma and some of these others. It's bigger than oil, defense, and tobacco combined. So those folks in Washington may not get it done. But if you are going to put forth a law like this that requires transparency or an executive action, as David mentioned, you've got to make sure that there's some skin in the game. And if you want to take what's on the books now, you've got to increase the skin in the game for the hospital systems. Otherwise, they just won't comply.
Okay, and David, you mentioned doing something at the state level too. Can states do more?
I do believe that. I do believe in increasing the skin in the game, but I don't have as much faith in the legislative impact that they'll have in making this better. I think the real benefit that'll impact the cost in healthcare is really going to be the patient and the employer. Once they have prices, they're going to be the ones to go out and demand of their insurers and of their hospital networks bundled pricing, decreased rates based on who's getting the best price. And so when they get engaged, which they should, because look, most organizations, most businesses, healthcare expenses are their second or third line item. It's a big expense to our nation's small and medium-sized employers and large employers. So it's time for them to get engaged in this issue and to use their influence, use their leverage to make a difference.
Do you see anyone doing that? Is there movement there?
I do. There are a number of organizations that are using cost-sharing organizations. They're changing the way that they offer the benefits, where the insurance is functioning more like insurance, but the employer is implementing models like direct primary care. They're using ambulatory surgery centers. And if you use the surgery center that has a reduced bundled rate, the employer will remove any type of coinsurance or deductible, and it'll be a zero out of pocket for their employees. So they're motivating them by giving them good incentives.
Interesting. All right, any final words to wrap up here, Seth?
No, I would just agree with that completely. We see that in employers that we represent all the time, and they're doing it more and more often, and they're seeing a better result. Matter of fact, on average, the employers that are implementing these strategies for the last number of years, we'll call it 3 to 5 years they've been doing it, are seeing flat trend in the healthcare space. It's one of those key areas where an employee gets a better experience, the employer reduces their costs simultaneously. So I'm glad that David brought that up because it's very important. The key to this is in that consumer market, engaged employees who are getting access to the system through their employer. And the more that they'll engage and stop getting out of just the insurance is the end-all be-all, the more we'll start moving the needle.
Excellent. All right. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Coming up after the break, we go back to the day President Ronald Reagan was shot. But first, here's America Q&A, where we ask people if they think kids are getting a good education in America today.
Compared to other countries, yes, but not all of the children in America.
I think it depends on the area.
No, definitely not. There's a lot of people that go to school and they learn all kinds of academic subjects, but ultimately they don't learn the most basic skills that they need to succeed in life.
No. I don't think that kids in America are getting the education they deserve.
Ugh, that's a really loaded question. I know that everybody in America deserves a free and appropriate education by law. I feel it depends on what state you live in, and it also depends on whether you live in an affluent neighborhood versus a lower income neighborhood.
I think that teachers are working very hard to do the best that they can under the circumstances.
I think yes, because at school they're teaching kids a lot about different stuff and about the world.
I think that it's a bit of a disadvantage right now because they are from, a lot of kids are virtual.
I feel like it basically depends on whatever class you're in, because I feel like the students on the higher class have a better advantage when it comes to education, but lower class students and some middle class students don't have that same advantage.
I think it depends on where they're coming.
Yes, we have a free public education system that every child is entitled to. It's basic. Not every country in the world has that.
My father used to teach me and all. No.
No, not at this time due to COVID.
No. I don't necessarily know the statistics, but I know we're not ranked top in the world.
I think that we could do a lot more to support public education.
In America, no. Recently, because I was also in school, and it would mostly be teachers forcing something upon you than actually, they trying to do something along with you.
Not the public schools. I think private schools are the better choice, Christian schools especially.
I think education kind of brings people towards one path where people need to diverge and figure out what they want to do.
I would say fairly getting good education.
I think the parochial schools are doing a better job.
Reading and writing is way more emphasized than some other parts, especially if you compare with the Asian part of the world where there's a lot more emphasis on the math side. The other beauty of the program over here is they have always the advanced classes, so there's much more flexible. That's the part I like it.
Yeah, I think especially Warwick County, all the school systems are all consistently rated really highly.
Not particularly. I think there's too much propaganda in the public schools with a lot of left-wing teachers spouting this notion.
Trends may be fleeting, but values are timeless. We now bring you this new clothing brand with classic design and luxurious comfort. It's our way of sharing hope and inspiration from the world of Shenyun. We bring you Shenyun Dancer. Wear it with honor.
Just about 40 years ago, on March 30th, 1981, a newly inaugurated President Ronald Reagan was almost killed by an assassin's bullet. It was a very close call and an unwelcome reminder of the murder of President John F. Kennedy a mere 18 years earlier. Fortunately, President Reagan fully recovered and went on to serve 2 terms, but the dramatic episode certainly had a lasting impact. To take us back to that day, we're joined now by Craig Shirly. He's a presidential historian and the author of not 1, but 4 books on President Ronald Reagan. Craig, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you very much for asking me.
So we're going to play the footage now of the assassination attempt back in 1981. And I'd like you to tell us what exactly we're seeing.
Okay, well, you're seeing John Hinckley. He's got a 22 caliber, and he's firing 6 shots at President Reagan, and he hits several other bystanders and security personnel, including Jim Brady, who was devastated with a headshot, and one shot ricocheted off of the limousine and cut into President Reagan's chest, the left side of his chest, and on the way to the hospital, a lung collapsed. He lost a lot of blood in his body, something like half of the blood in his body, and he almost died. If it hadn't been for the speedy work of the surgeons and his own personal physique, Ronald Reagan would have died that day.
But yet he did walk into the hospital. That he rejected being carried in.
You're right. Yeah, he insisted on walking into the hospital, and as soon as he got in the hospital, he collapsed and almost went into shock, which is a very dangerous proposition. But he didn't, fortunately. But he did collapse once inside the hospital. His own pride wouldn't let him be taken in a wheelchair or on a gurney or be carried in like that, something like that whatsoever. He only collapsed once inside the hospital.
Amazing. One of the other remarkable things I remember reading is he was cracking jokes, actually, right after it happened as well, right?
It was yes, he was. When he was going under the knife, and when he was having surgery and after surgery, he was writing down. He couldn't talk because they had to cut a hole in his throat for the oxygen to pass into his lungs. But he had a pad of paper and a pen, and he wrote notes that he gave to Lynn Nofsinger, and then Lynn Nofsinger passed them on to the press. There were many jokes at the time. Like he said to at one point, he was told that the government is functioning normally, and he responded in writing, "What makes you think I'd be happy about that?" Just stuff like that. And it passed along, and of course, millions of people heard about this, so it was very reassuring to the American people that Ronald Reagan could be as lighthearted as he was in that traumatic time.
Did he also say, or is this a myth, that he said to the surgeon, "I hope you're all Republicans"?
No, that's absolutely true. He had a physician, Dr. Howard Giordano, who was about to cut into Reagan's chest to remove the bullet. And Reagan said to his attending physicians, and he said before he went under the knife, he turned to the physicians and he said, "I hope some of you fellows are Republicans." And Dr. Giordano responded, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans." And it was a very unifying moment in our nation's history.
Wow. Yeah, and this was just, 70 days into his presidency. So, the American people really got to see what this man was made of.
Absolutely. And it formed a bond with the American people that hadn't existed before. Reagan was brand new. He was untested. It was his challenge, and it was something he responded to quite well. And the American people carried a level of affection for him they hadn't had before.
I think we all know about the great love between Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan. What can you tell us about Nancy's reaction that day and the days that ensued?
Yeah, that's a good question, Cindy. She was, of course, like the rest of the country, she was horrified. This was not just the president, this was her husband. And she immediately rushed to his side and stayed at his side pretty much the whole time he was there at George Washington Hospital. And in the days afterwards, she met with the Secret Service department heads and gave them unshirted hell about protecting the president and insisting that this never happened to him again. And she was quite frank in her anger and quite frank in her comments to the Secret Service.
What changed in terms of protocols after this?
Oh, a lot, actually. The president intermingled with the American people far less than Reagan did in 1981. Is that there were more Secret Service agents. There was less of him walking in public, protective service around him at all times. It really, John Kennedy's assassination in 1963, and then 18 years later, Reagan's attempted assassination, really brought home the reality of the modern world to the Secret Service, and they increased their budget. They got more people, men and women. They limited the president's access to the American people. They really downplayed it. So that's one of the sad consequences to the modern world that we live in, is the people don't have the personal contact with the president that they used to have, that they did have, say, in Dwight Eisenhower's time, or Franklin Roosevelt's time, or Harry Truman's time, even though two of them were the victims of assassination attempts. Is that it was really the JFK assassination and then the attempted assassination of Reagan that brought it home to the Secret Service and all the protective detail around the president, which is that he is not just one of us. He has to be kept at a distance and kept protected so this never happened again.
Yeah, it is remarkable looking back at the footage of him just walking out of the hotel and being right there on the street.
Yeah, it really is. And that's the way the presidency was from George Washington's time up until Reagan's time. Was the president, whoever it was out in the open and often mingled with the American people. Right back to Lincoln's time and even before, they would interview prospective job applicants and settle disputes and pretty much act as a normal human being. There wasn't a gate around the White House complex. That only came in the 1930s when FDR was president. People used to go to the White House, and the federal bureaucrats used to picnic there at lunch, and the president was a much more down-to-earth common man in that era than they are now. Now the whole bureaucracy has been built up around the president, both on the civil service side and on the defensive side, to ensure that this never befalls the president again.
One of the other things that happened that day is that the Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, declared himself in charge, which was a bit unusual. Yes. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was complete mayhem, as you can imagine, Cindy, between the people who were attending to Reagan and the people who were at the White House. And don't forget, too, this was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was eyeing this very carefully, and a lot of people thought at the time the Soviet Union was behind the assassination attempt on Reagan because he was such a strong Cold Warrior, which it wasn't true, but a lot of people thought at the time. And they had a press conference, a hurried, organized press conference that was not very well organized, and Al Haig mistakenly said that I'm in charge here, which was not true. It was the Vice President Bush, who was in an airplane on his way back to Washington, and then the Speaker of the House, constitutionally, and then the Senate pro tem of the U.S. Senate. So it would have passed to Tip O'Neill if it had gone that far, but it fortunately didn't. But the Secretary of State is long down the list, not the second or third person on line, as Haig mistakenly said, and added to an air of it was real surreal atmosphere to Washington and the world and the nation that day, Cindy. And Al Haig's sweaty composure really added to it. It didn't add a lot. And as a footnote, you might know Reagan didn't like Al Haig. And he wrote in his diaries, Al Haig resigned a year later at Reagan's insistence. And Reagan wrote in his diaries that night that Al Haig had resigned, and then wrote, the only thing we disagreed about was who was president.
That's a great line.
Yeah.
So I want to go for a moment to the assassin, John Hinckley Jr., because this wasn't a political assassination, as all the others in the past had been.
No, it was not. It was for the bizarre reason I'm trying to impress a Hollywood starlet that he had a crush on and had been stalking her, and it was to try. He'd watched the movie Taxi Driver over and over and over, starring Robert De Niro as a man going crazy, trying to oppress a young, attractive campaign worker. And his way of doing it was to try to assassinate the politician she was working for. And so Hinckley got the idea from watching this movie over and over and over of assassinating Reagan to try to impress Jodie Foster. And of course, it didn't work. And everybody paid a huge price that day. Unfortunately, John Hinckley didn't. He only went to a mental institution and then was freed. And this for killing Jim Brady and almost killing the President of the United States.
Right. Jim Brady died how many years after? I mean, from injuries because of
He died several years ago, but the coroner reported he died something like 20 years after the assassination attempt. And the coroner report when Jim passed away, Jim was an old friend of mine, the coroner's report when he passed away, Cindy said that he died as a result of homicide. So John Hinckley is a proven murderer, and yet he's walking around on the streets today down here in Virginia, and justice was never served. Unlike in this case, to say like Sirhan, who's still in prison for the assassination of Robert Kennedy back in 1968.
Right. So 5 years ago, Hinckley was released.
That's correct. Yes. And he never served hard time. Justice was never served, despite everybody writing letters to the judges, including Mrs. Reagan, Nancy Reagan, writing letters to the judges, pleading that Hinckley be put behind bars and be kept away from the Reagan family because they thought he had bad intentions.
But one of the amazing things is that Ronald Reagan actually wanted to meet him to forgive him personally, and his doctors didn't think that was a good idea, John Hinckley Jr.'s doctors.
Nope, that's true. Reagan had been shot. He thought long and hard about it. He prayed and he forgave John Hinckley. He actually, as I wrote in one of my books, that he wanted to meet with John Hinckley, and he never did, on the advice of the psychiatrist at St. Elizabeth Hospital, because they said it would simply be an act of empowering of John Hinckley, that he wouldn't understand that Reagan was trying to forgive him, that Hinckley would see it as some kind of vindication for himself or empowerment of himself.
So we've got to wrap up, but one last question I have to ask you, since you've written 4 books on Ronald Reagan, obviously you know a lot about the man and his legacy. What do you think would have been different?
I worked for him, too.
And you worked for him. So what do you think would have been different had John Hinckley Jr. succeeded in his assassination attempt?
That is a great question. I think everything would have changed. If George Bush had become president, the end of the Cold War would not have happened as quickly as it did under Reagan. The economy would have been different under President Bush early on, say in 1981, than what it was under Ronald Reagan. Your attitude, my attitude, our American people attitudes toward government, freedom, and our personal relationship with our government would have been fundamentally different. George Bush basically believed in government, and Ronald Reagan didn't. And it was Reagan's philosophy that carried the day in 1980 and in 1984.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Craig. We really appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure.
And that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us every Saturday, 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. And from all of us here, have a great week.
Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news source.